Good morning. It's still morning here. Good afternoon, good evening, depending on what part of the world you're in. Welcome. This is day 4, marathon conference, but high energy, important issues, wonderful panels. And this is our last keynote address, but Sheila Foster, the last keynote speaker, certainly not the least. I'm delighted to introduce her to all of you today. Sheila R. Foster is the Scott K. Ginsberg Professor of Urban Law and Policy at Georgetown University. She holds a joint appointment with the Georgetown Law School and the McCourt School of Public Policy. Foster is a recognized authority on the role of cities and city leadership in promoting social and economic welfare, achieving environmental and climate justice, improving global governance, and addressing racial inequality. From 2017 to 2020, she served as the chair of the advisory committee for the, panel on climate. I'm sorry, she's currently a member of the New York City Mayor's panel on climate change and is a former member of the Aspen Institute's Urban Innovation Group. Her influential scholarship is published in top law journals such as Yale, Berkeley, Harvard, Notre Dame, and in books by NYU Press, MIT Press, Cambridge University Press, and Oxford University Press. In addition to Georgetown, Sheila Foster has taught at a number of major American and international universities, including University of California at Berkeley, Rutgers, Fordham, Imperial College, and I will pass, there are so many, but I will mention the Luis Guido Carli University in Rome, because this is how Sheila and I met through her colleague, Christian Ioni. Sheila Foster's work focuses on the intersection of law, policy, and governance with a specific focus on urban communities and cities. She's one of the leading scholars on environmental and climate justice, most recently recognized by the International Union for Conservation of Nature Academy of Environmental Law's 2018 Senior Scholarship Award. Her work analyzes urban governance and the right to the city through the lens of the commons, as most comprehensively examined in her forthcoming MIT Press book, Co-Cities with Christian Ioni. Her work also focuses on the role of cities in international law and global governance, and is exemplified by her forthcoming work, City Networks and Glocalization of Urban Governance, in the Elgar Research Handbook of International Law and Cities. I just want to mention one thing before I turn the screen over to Sheila, and that is her collaboration with Christian Ioni in a research institute called LabGov, which has been doing research and extraordinary amount of writing on the role of communities, local governments, civil society organizations, the role of the university and certain private actors in a process of collaboration and shared governance. Adapting in many ways the work of Elinor Ostrom and polycentric governance. This, I think, is really important work. Sheila, I'm delighted that you are with us today and at this conference on the role of the state. And we've been focusing really on the nation state and on international relations. There has been some mention of local government. I think this last keynote address is really important to bring us back to our communities and the role of the local state. Thank you for being with us.
Thank you, Margie. It's a pleasure to be here, and I'm quite flattered to be giving this keynote. I believe that you were going to mention, and it's where I'll start today, that I was chair of the advisory committee for the Global Parliament of Mayors, which was launched by Professor Ben Barber, and you'll see his quote here. And this is where I want to start today. I had the pleasure of working alongside Dr. Barber, who's the author of If Mayors Ruled the World, among many books. But I worked with him right before his death to launch his brainchild, the Global Parliament of Mayors, in March 2016. And shortly before his death, in a City Lab conversation, he reiterated the argument on the screen now that the relationship between national and local government has been inverted in the 21st century, with many of our most progressive laws and policies coming from below. So he says in the 19th and 20th centuries, local meant parochial, local meant backwards, local meant reactionary. The fundamental balance between national and local has been inverted. What in the 19th century was a defense of universal rights by national government and resistance to that by racists and localists, today has been exactly inverted. Every progressive policy you look for, whether it's minimum wage, defensive rights, defense of immigrants, is now an urban one, a local one. And national government has become reactionary, not universal. And it's not just the United States. National governments are increasingly parochial. Cities are increasingly cosmopolitan. It's exactly reverse, which gives cities a whole new role. So cities, Barbara's key argument was that that mayors and local leaders should no longer accept the second-class, disenfranchised, virtually invisible status given to them when the current international world order was erected by nation states in the aftermath of World War II. A world order that he thought continues to place national governments at the pinnacle of global power and influence. He recognized the declining productivity and rising insularity of many of these national governments, as well as their inability to agree or compromise when attempting to resolve cross-border challenges. So despite the fact that cities and their leaders are structurally and legally powerless vis-a-vis national and international governments and institutions, the United Nations has nations in the title. International law is international law. Barber nevertheless argued that cities could operate as powerful agents of global governance and exert considerable power in pushing forward global agendas on a range of cross-border issues like climate change and migration. And his passionate argument for cities' role in global governance was a pragmatic call to action for mayors and other city leaders. But it was also a recognition that a shift was already underway. Consider the realm of climate change, for instance, in which for many years, cities have been in front of. So when the 114 heads of state failed to come to an agreement at the Conference of Parties in Copenhagen, COP15 in 2009, over 200 mayors attended a parallel climate summit where they agreed on collaborative efforts to meet the goals of international climate agreements, even when states could not. Before COP21, which was negotiated in Paris, states had already conducted 20 COPs since 1995, meaning national leaders had repeatedly declared that they would act together for at least 20 years without any significant achievements. And this consistent collective action by cities, some have argued, was a significant factor in pushing nation states to the historical agreement between nations in Paris at COP21. Now, both, of course, the Paris Agreement and the UNFCCC Climate Action Agenda recognize the need to involve cities. And this year's forthcoming COP summit in Glasgow will likely feature an unprecedented number of mayors, as well as local leaders and city networks. So cities around the world, Barbara argued, are cooperating already through cross-border transnational networks like C40, ICLEI, Covenant of Mayors, vowing to work alongside nation states to reach the goals of international agreements. But when nation states fail to reach agreement, or when they renege on them, as the US did under the last presidential administration, cities have vowed to go it alone. So just consider for a moment the actions of C40, right? C40 represents 97 of the world's cities, over 700 million citizens, and 1/4 of the global economy. And according to one of its latest climate action and megacities reports shown here, there's evidence that when climate action by nation states has been at a stall, C40 cities have put in place over 8,000 climate actions, leveraging over 2.8 billion in funding and impacting millions of urban dwellers worldwide. Now, the massive influence of cities in this way is one testament or exhibition to the ways that cities are exercising what some call their soft power through international city networks and leveraging their status as the world's primary engines of wealth creation. As the chart shows here, cities are the top gross domestic product producers. In some cases, the largest cities outproduce many nation states. In the US, for instance, the 10 most productive metropolitan areas contribute about 40% of the gross domestic product. The New York Metro alone makes up about 10% of the total GDP and produces 4% more economic output than the entire country of Canada. Outside of the US, the numbers are as stark, if not starker, right? Cities such as Toronto, Mexico City, Tokyo, London, Paris, Stockholm, Tel Aviv, and Seoul generate anywhere from 18 to over 50% of their national GDP. So for this reason, many international relations and legal scholars recognize that cities are gaining influence and power, not so much through the hard law of international treaties and agreements, as much as through wielding their soft power, their economic and cultural influence to take on actions such as climate change and migration. Now, this phenomenon has been recognized long ago by scholars like Anne-Marie Slaughter in her book, A New World Order, this foundational book, in which she argued that, and which is now a well-accepted proposition, that states are no longer the only relevant actor on the global stage. Instead, a variety of non-state actors exert real influence and achieve tangible successes alongside nation states. These non-state global actors that she named included multinational corporations, advocacy group, professional expertise associations, nonprofits, among others. They operate, according to her and other international relations scholars, as global governors or actors who exercise power across borders with some degree of legitimacy and continuity for purposes of affecting policy in an issue area. However, although this study of global governance expanded, moved from government to governance with a collection of actors influencing global issues and international decisions, this literature for a long time ignored cities, right? Cities were not a part of her New World Order and were quite underappreciated in the literature until the work of scholars, not just of Ben Barber, but Michele Acuto and Ron Herschel, among others. According to these more recent urban scholars, cities represent one of the many spheres of authority that define and shape modern international relations. Right. And so you can't understand the infrastructure of international politics unless you recognize that it operates alongside, sometimes in collaboration, sometimes in contestation, sometimes in parallel with novel forms of authority, sovereignty, and transnational agency exercised by cities, among others. A colleague and I did a study for the Global Parliament of Mayors a few years ago in trying to chart the arenas of action and agency by the rise of transnational city networks. And by transnational, we mean not regional, but cross-border, across nation states, right? And across regions. So mayors from Europe, Africa, Latin America, et cetera. And there are now at least 99 of these networks, according to our study. Of course, city networking is not a new phenomenon. It can be traced back to at least the early 20th century, if not long before, when these networks focused on city-to-city initiatives, such as sister cities or informational gatherings to exchange best practices. But what we found is new and different about city networking today is that many, though not all, of these networks now devote additional resources to international lobbying, or what's referred to as city diplomacy at the global level, in a very direct attempt to influence the international policymaking process in unprecedented new ways. What's also new is the breadth of topics and issues covered by these existing city networks. So we found that while 60% of networks focus on one issue or a small handful of related issues, such as the environment and climate change, The remaining 40% focus on a wide variety of topics, including economic issues, security, counterterrorism, migration, education, culture, and public health. What's most important, however, is that the way that these networks are forming alliances with each other and acting alongside international institutions like the UN and other international organizations to influence the global agenda, really, in global governance. And the currency of this soft power, I've argued, are these well-resourced city networks. So the currency of city soft power, rather, are really these well-resourced networks, like the largest ones, in particular C40, the UCLG, the United Cities and Local Governments, and now the Global Parliament of Mayor, which are leveraging their influence, not just of the world's biggest city mayors, but their alliances with other influential actors in the public and private sphere. One example of this kind of alliance is, and a peak moment, I think, in the role of transnational city networks in global governance, was in 2013 with the creation of by the UN of the Global Task Force on Local and Regional Governance. This is a forum that includes over 37 city networks that are both depicted in this slide, in this next slide here. It's a forum where the perspectives of local and regional governments can be taken into account when discussing global policies at an international institution, again, originally designed for nation states. The Global Task Force, for example, successfully lobbied for the inclusion of Sustainable Development Goal 11 in the urban agenda. It also convenes the World Assembly of Local and Regional Governments and was instrumental in drafting the new urban agenda. The very existence of the Global Task Force does represent a significant symbolic step forward for cities in their efforts to pierce the traditionally nation states only structure of international institutions. But even when these networks don't have a seat at the table, literally, there is evidence that their collective voices are nevertheless reaching global policymakers. And one recent example is the collective push by cities in 2018 for influence over the drafting of the Global Compact for Migration and the Global Compact on Refugees, both ultimately adopted by the UN General Assembly in 2018. Leaders of over 150 cities signed the Mechelen Declaration, and close to 200 mayors and city leaders adopted the Marrakesh Mayoral Declaration, which called for the formal recognition of the role of cities and local authorities in the implementation, follow-up, and review of these two compacts, very important international compacts. In recognizing the centrality of cities on this topic, the UN High Commissioner on Refugees enthusiastically endorsed the Marrakech Declaration in a speech highlighting the necessity of working with city leaders to solve the global migration and refugee crisis. And in the end, the official drafts of both the Compact on Migration and the Compact on Refugees each reference local and city government nearly 40 times in setting out the crafting and implementation of international norms for migrants and refugees. And in addition, the Mayor's Migration Council was also officially launched that year in Marrakech on the margins of the UN conference there, as was a new institutional platform called the Mayor's Mechanism, which was created by the state-led Global Forum on Migration and Development in 2018 as a way of providing a formal channel and input by cities and regional governments and nation states on issues pertaining to migration and development. But I want to return to Barbara's vision for a moment, because, well, I want to suggest that the kind of structural reforms that I've just talked about, like the Global Task Force and also the influence on these global compacts, were actually not really what he had in mind when he suggested that mayors could rule the world. For sure, city networks can be powerful global agenda setters rather. So on the left, I have what I call globalism, right? City networks can elevate, amplify the voices of mayors and other local leaders in the halls of international institutions and in solving important transborder global issues such as migration and and climate, sorry. However, it would be a mistake to view their collective action and the potential power of these networks as confined to influencing international policymakers and the development of international legal norms or global issues. As Barbara argued, cities can most effectively exercise their soft power by acting collectively to share and implement common policies and practices at home in ways that, he said, directly affect more than half of the world's population and indirectly serve the entire planet. His view was that mayors need not await the cooperation of international institutions, multinational corporations, nor dysfunctional nation states. Cities are already engaged in governance at home, putting in place policies that fulfill the urban quest to secure justice and security for its residents and citizens. So I've argued that global city networking and these kind of city alliances are best understood as critical spaces and platforms for glocalization or glocalism on critical issues like income inequality, urban citizenship, as well as climate change and migration. So the term glocalism first appeared in the late 1980s in articles by Japanese economists in the Harvard Business Review. But it was the sociologist Roland Robertson who's credited with popularizing the term glocalization to refer to the tempering effects of local conditions on global pressures. And so in a 1997 conference on globalization and indigenous culture, Robertson said that globalization means the simultaneity, the co-presence of both universalizing and particularizing tendencies, meaning the diffuse action that spring from local movements that are oriented towards governing global problems or challenges from the bottom up. So I use the term to suggest that cities are inserting themselves as important actors in local government or governance at a time when international and national institutions are perceived as failing to adequately address urgent challenges that most intensively impact cities around the world and that bind their fates together. Challenges like, again, escalating economic inequality, affordable housing, climate forced migration, urban violence. And this global dimension of dimension of the relationship between local leaders and between those leaders and higher levels of government brings, I think, more clearly into view the role of cities in these networks on the global stage without exaggerating or romanticizing their level of influence on international institutions or international law, which is still relatively weak. So global city networks are sites not just for influencing international actors and processes, but play an indispensable role in providing local leaders, most notably mayors, platforms for enabling policy diffusion, empowering cities to adopt and adapt policies to address shared challenges, and then scaling perhaps those policies to higher levels of government where appropriate. So what does this look like? So one example is the move by cities to more assertively recognize and secure human rights through the formation of human rights cities when their nation states fail to adopt human rights on a national level, right? So cities are increasingly recognizing and securing to every city inhabitant the right to have access to essential resources and services. The city of Madrid, for instance, recently introduced a strategic human rights plan that grants every person living in Madrid the right to basic urban services, health, education, security, social services, energy, and telecommunications. And the city is committed to realizing this right progressively on the basis of principles of maximum use of resources and equality. Another example is the New Urban Agenda itself, the network of emerging human rights cities and the effort to operationalize the SDGs in cities, right? Not to wait on international bodies to do it, but for local governments to operationalize them by instantiating certain rights at the local level is among the ways that I think cities are taking bolder stances than their nation states. The vision encapsulated in the New Urban Agenda is that of a sustainable urban future that aims to end poverty, achieve gender equality, a just energy transition, access to safe and affordable drinking water and sanitation, among other goals. Another example, particularly potent in the US and particularly under the Trump administration, is our cities enacting policies that stand in direct defiance of national policies, such as with sanctuary cities or welcoming cities outside of the US. The depiction here is the number of sanctuary cities in each state in the US. Often these policies run ideologically and politically, again, counter to the position taken by national governments, as an escalating number of these governments throughout the world have become increasingly insular and xenophobic. And in response, right, these cities are not only the world's largest global cities, but including are opening their doors even wider to migrants and refugees in an attempt to buck these backward and in many cases, racist trends. Another example here in the US, city leaders are trying to get out in front of national and sometimes international institutions to set more ambitious policies to address widespread economic inequality. This US Mayors Network, founded in June 2020, just last year, in the midst of the COVID health and economic crisis by ex-Stockton, California Mayor Michael Tubbs, is a now over 40 city network of mayors for a guaranteed income. And as the slide says, the mayors believe, right, that in order to address income inequality, right, that we need to support something that the national government refuses to, and that is a universal basic income. In Stockton, Mayor Tubbs began giving 125 residents $500 per month. And on the heels of that successful experiment, 40 cities represented by this map here, over 40 cities are now piloting their own guaranteed income, but adapted to local context. Again, this is not a cut and paste. It's more adapting a strategy and diffusing policy, but applying it in local context. So for instance, in Jackson, Mississippi, they're giving $1,000 per month just to Black mothers because Jackson is a predominantly Black city and poverty there is focused around motherhood. So the final part of this idea of glocalism and glocalization that I want to emphasize is what some scholars refer to as upscaling. So I've talked about diffusion, policy diffusion in these networks across mayors and cities around the world. But there is also this idea that some scholars like Kern have called upscaling, right? Through collective actions, declarations, and commitments, cities around the world are creating their own set of legal norms and policies outside of the narrow strictures of international law and international institutions that are not really built for their participation. And one way to understand, right, what they're doing is bottom-up lawmaking. I've talked about that, right? The literature on bottom-up lawmaking is useful in conceptualizing cities' roles in the making and shaping of law. But the other way is to think about how it scales upward, right? How these norms around shared on-the-ground experiences and policies eventually begin to scale up and scale down, right? So in part because cities are interacting with international norms and standards like human rights across international borders, but importantly, they're localizing them. So scholar Christine Kern talks about this concept of scaling, noting that upscaling is a process that's characterized not just by diffusion, but expansion and transformation. In her attempt to carefully define this term, she articulates 4 different types of scaling. One is horizontal upscaling, which is based on voluntary actions and direct relations between leading cities. Vertical upscaling, which is shaped by the interdependent relationships between cities and higher levels of government. It could be national or regional, EU, or international government. Hierarchical upscaling, which leads to harmonization of policies at the national or regional level that then sets mandatory standards for all municipalities, and embedded upscaling, which combines horizontal, vertical, and hierarchical, and is linked to the concept of polycentric governance. So this concept of scaling, when added to the insights of bottom-up lawmaking, right, or that literature on bottom-up lawmaking, is useful when thinking about how norms created by city networks have the potential not only to change the lives of urban residents all over the world through the collective action of local leaders, but also to influence and shape the contents of national, regional, and transnational legal norms and policies. And the result of all these activities, bottom-up lawmaking, networking, and upscaling, all result in policy diffusion and convergence around specific issues and strategies. Once diffused, these policies are over time are becoming benchmarks for collective action among cities, particularly the large global cities, and can help to hold city leaders and their networks to account. So one of the things that we see in this area is not just diffusion of policy, but actually, as with C40, cities holding themselves to accountability metrics. So if cities are going to chip away at a global collective action problem like climate or even migration, it's not just that they are on their own turf enacting policies like sanctuary cities, but they're also coming together to agree on collective action, either to reduce carbon in their cities and then to report back and hold each other accountable through networks like C40. And so importantly, this process of scaling and convergence is facilitated again by city networks. And this is again where the particularly large and powerful networks like C40 and UCLG play a very important role in these processes, not just a bottom-up lawmaking, but upscaling and ultimately polycentric governance. And in this way, major cities and these major city networks, I think, also act as norm entrepreneurs for smaller, less powerful cities and less powerful networks whose behaviors and policies often end up falling into line with this collective action, resulting in convergence around specific methods and substantive goals. So this new era of glocalism, and I'll start to conclude here, is upon us already. And cities and their leaders are at the forefront of it. Cities and their networks are now decisively established as influential global actors in the difficult task of governing the globe. Their views and opinions are not just incorporated into many multilateral nation state-led actions, but also unilateral city-led agendas and policies. And they're working together in diffusing those policies and even scaling them horizontally and vertically and embedding them. While questions, I think, remain about whether our current international system can genuinely incorporate the views of cities or the views of actors, rather, not just cities, other than nations and the most powerful economic actors, instances of bottom-up city networking and upscaling continue to mount. The continued proliferation of city networks are critical spaces for this policy diffusion and convergence. These networks empower cities to collectively respond to cross-border challenges without waiting on their nation states to act. And they are often spaces where local governments, even when they lack legal power at home, can act and often act in tension with their regional and national authorities, and sometimes cooperate with international institutions when their nation states are not aligned with the particular policies or values that they're advocating. Now, finally, this is not to say that cities, right, are immune from the many challenges and pitfalls that inhere in this, I think, difficult and complex job of multi-level governance and polycentric governance. But if recent history is any guide, cities and their networks are successfully navigating, I think, this complex terrain and learning how to effectively bridge the local and the global divide in ways that states have either been unable or unwilling to do. So as Wellington Webb says here, if the 19th century was a century of empires, the 20th of nation states, the 21st century is already, I think, the century of cities. Thanks, I'll stop there.
Start my video. Am I there? Okay,
Mhm.
sorry. Yeah, forgive me, Sheila, because of course, I guess I was enthusiastically running through all your extraordinary engagements and publications that I forgot the one that inspired the invitation for you to speak, namely your role in the Global Parliament of Mayors. And I see, thank you very much. I mean, you've raised really important issues, I think, particularly for this conference, but not only. I have some questions or things comments I'd like to make, but I see that there is a question on the Q&A. So I'll read it to you, and it's from Jerome Nikolai Warren. Great message. Thank you very much for this talk. You speak of the importance and vitality of cities as locations for civic dialogue and culture. Looking back, the discourse around democracy also began in cities, particularly Greek cities in the Mediterranean. Can we learn how to grow and develop new democratic foundations by returning to the original idea of democracy as civic community?
Yeah, that's a very important comment. The one thing I will comment on that I did not in the talk is this idea that, so why should city leaders and mayors be, valorized as these networks do? And I think it's because, and Barbara argued this, that they're the closest to the civic community, right? To the polis, to the democratic polis. Barbara's previous books were on, his classic book was Strong Democracy. And Strong Democracy really was about fostering that culture at the local level, right? Where democracy means, strong democracy means strong civic participation, strong civic community. So these networks, I think, are only legitimate insofar as the leaders that participate and come to them actually represent and engage with their polis, right? With their civic culture and their democratic culture in their local areas and cities. And my other work on LabGov and with the comment is really about that, right? Is really about polycentric governance within a city and the various forms in which strong civic engagement, and not just civic engagement, but actually a collective claim by citizens to the city itself, the city as a commons, is important in terms of this idea of democracy or a local democracy that functions in ways that is not just democratic for the sake of democracy, but it's also just and incorporates a number of other values, inclusive and just, as well as forward-looking.
Okay, I see there's no question coming in the Q&A, so I will ask a first question. As you know well, there are jurisdictional issues that are important, divisions of power. For example, in Canada, cities are, and I quote, creatures of provinces. And so in many ways, if you take that literally, they are residual. In other places, cities have much more responsibility for social programs, and often these are in countries with much deeper inequality. I think of Brazil and Argentina, for example. So where does this issue come in? And just as a kind of footnote to that, the paradox is that cities are increasingly pressured by their national governments to do more and to take on more responsibilities for social and economic and environmental issues. But the resources don't flow. And then this jurisdictional restriction remains. Does that enter into your thinking?
Absolutely. So mayors say all the time, we're coming together to empower ourselves because we lack this power, right, in our national context. So how are they trying to get power if legally and structurally, both in terms of the international, but also the national states, the same in the US, right? That, cities are not mentioned in the Constitution. They only have as much power as the states give them. What's interesting about this phenomenon of international city networking is the ways that cities are jumping over their nation states to go to the international arena to grab soft power, to not only exercise it there. The example of the migration, for instance, cities are on the front lines of the migration and climate crisis often. So they have limited power to deal with it at home, right? Because of partly the lack of resources. Where their nation states aren't moving on it, they can't go there, right, to get relief. So what are they doing? They're jumping over the nation states, and they're working with other mayors and another collection of actors. Also, think about C40. A lot of that is private and foundation money. That and Michael Bloomberg, that's funding literally billions of dollars of money that is going into local action for climate change. I think, and at home here in the US with this new mayor's UBI network, none of that is funded by public dollars, right? In fact, in some localities like Stockton, there was pushback from a lot of the constituents that, how dare you spend public money on giving away money? The answer was, I'm not spending public money. A lot of this is private and foundation money funding these experiments. And the idea is to upscale them. If we can show they work in cities around the US, right, maybe the federal government will, and in fact, President Biden has done just that, right? An important part of the Jobs Act is basically giving up to $3,000 a year to poor families to cut poverty in half. So this idea, and I'm a legal scholar, so this idea that cities lack power, I think, is exactly the reason why they're trying to grab soft power. They lack hard power. Yeah. And their soft power lies, again, in the number of people that live within their borders, but also the economic power increasingly that cities have. So I hope that answers your question.
It does. Thank you. There are two questions.
Mm-hmm.
Another one from Jerome Warren. Sheila Foster, you are yourself in Washington, D.C. As the Congress debates making D.C. a state, can you speak a bit about the context of home rule in the United States? You spoke, for instance, of Jackson, a city that is in constant conflict with the government of Mississippi, also in Jackson. Since the U.S. Constitution sees no inherent rights for municipalities, does there need to be some fundamental constitutional right of the city, not to speak of the rights to the city?
Yeah, so the Washington, D.C. statehood movement is a separate, right? That's the movement to make D.C. a state. Why? So just, and this gets to your question, right? Our Constitution says that all powers not explicitly given to the federal government belong to the states. So states are the repository of most of the powers in the U.S. And then states in turn give those powers through home rule, sometimes, not always, to cities. Mississippi is not a home rule state, right? In states without home rule, cities have to approach the governor or the state legislature to ask to act. So one response to that conundrum that cities particularly, and what's the political backdrop of this, is that a lot of cities are blue, Democratic, left-leaning, and they're on a red island. So, and hence, and we saw this during COVID with, cities wanting to shut down, put in place mask mandates, and governors who were of the other party preempting or overruling them. We're probably not going to solve that problem constitutionally. There's no political headwinds that are going to give cities more power. And I think that the reason that cities, so the mayor of Jackson and the movement in Jackson actually comes, Lumumba, who comes out of a social movement, right? And I think we saw this in Atlanta, which is in Georgia in the last election. There's actually quite a lot of, I should say, local power in these cities because of the concentration of people there and the things that they're able to do in spite of a limited lack of local rights is an example. So like the UBI network, right? That's an example of all kinds of cities that are able to pool with other actors, right? So think about that new world order. It's not just governments, it's governance. And cities are figuring out how to partner with, different actors, and pooling their resources to move forward this kind of action in their even when they lack the legal power. So this is my point. Even this distinction between hard power and soft power. And I do think we see cities exercising soft power. It's not enough in some instances. So in Jackson, they have a water crisis. You're not going to solve that crisis through soft power. You actually need hard infrastructure. And I think that's coming with the Biden infrastructure bill. But nevertheless, it is in the absence of that hard power. I think the point is that, cities don't just have to lay back or sit back and feel powerless. They are finding ways to move their agendas forward with other cities and other actors.
Thank you. There's there's two more questions.
Mm-hmm.
The next one is, this is Francisco Bozano Barnes, how can you harmonize city influence with urban ecology, understood as the creation of ecological differentiation caused by urban industrial expansion and rural interests? The question mark.
Yeah. I'm not sure what you mean, but let me give it a try, right? So there is an urban-rural divide. If you see the city as an ecological place and cities as complex ecosystems, but more than cities, I've argued in my work, it's really regions, right? And I think if we think about the connectivity of what's happening in cities, the economic power of cities, the concentration of residents and most of the population, and then all of the challenges and opportunities that come along with that. We are starting to think beyond the urban to the regional metropolitan, including the urban-rural connection. So the Brookings Institute in Washington, D.C. has shed light on what they call micropolitan areas. And they found that rural areas that are part of a micropolitan area close to towns and cities do better socially and economically than rural areas that are outside of those. And that's really a call to figure out how to create economic and social and ecological environments that bring urban and rural together in some kind of economy or regional infrastructure way. So I hope I've answered that as best as I could, given what I understood to be the question.
Another question from Tanya Mazikot. Does the breakpoint between cities and the nation state that they answer, sorry, let me just see if I can work through this one. That they answer from have to do perhaps with the fact that the nation state has to reinforce imagined nationalism based on subjective attributes, whereas cities organize themselves naturally, hence build fabrics around common ground, perhaps more tangible than the so-called national attributes.
I'm not sure, right? So nation states are so I take your point that nation states are constructs, right? They're created, their boundaries are defined, their powers are plenary, particularly over the borders, et cetera. And they have a incentive to create national right societies and norms, et cetera, and try to shape our mindset to do that. And cities organize themselves naturally in the sense that, I guess, cities are created by people who choose to move there, right? But you could say the same things about nation states. At least we used to be here in the US, a nation of immigrants, right? So we're created by the melting pot and people coming here. In both cases, I don't know that there's that much of a breaking point. There certainly is with regard to the hard law, right? And the hard powers of cities and nation states. But I think one of the lessons that I've tried to convey is the kind of the shift in morphology, right? The concentration of people, but economic power, not around nation states, but around urban areas and cities, is, I think, a really market point here, an inflection point that the scholarship of urbanism has run with, right? Whether it's urban economists like Ed Glazer, who say, listen, urban agglomeration, we got to fit everyone, let's build up, right? Because cities are where we make people happier, healthier, and prosperous. Or political philosophers and scientists like Barber, who say that, urban agglomeration, let's flex that power politically, right? And let's use that power in the quest for what Barbara called urban justice, to secure the rights for people. So either way, I think you see a focus on these urban agglomerations and both their challenges, but the opportunities, as a way to reduce the focus on the nation state, not because we think urban can substitute for nation states, because, and Barbara argued this, the dysfunction that the nation state has become. And we see that in many nation states, whether it's political kind of the political blockade that we see in the US with parties not being able to get stuff done, to the failure to reach, climate agreements over time.
There are no questions coming in, so I'm going to ask you to share with the audience your work, a little bit of your work on the co-city, on the city as commons. And perhaps because of the focus of this conference and your talk, on how this has challenged or sort of upended in some cases governance of cities by getting mayors to actually work with communities in this polycentric framework. Perhaps you could just introduce some of this to the people who are listening.
Sure. So our work at LabGov in trying to capture what we see as a real movement in different kinds of cities around the world toward a kind of not just a co-creation, but a co-governance mode in which mayors and cities are increasingly willing to work with, communities. And really, when I say communities, I mean a collection of actors at the hyper-local level, not just residents, but anchor institutions, whether they're churches or whether they're or religious institutions, or whether they're community-based organizations that are housing organizations, and sometimes local businesses and private actors, and often knowledge institutions, that cities are increasingly willing to work with this collection of hyperlocal actors within their communities to build in place and to govern urban infrastructure in place. What does this mean? First of all, it starts with the basic needs around housing and food security, and sometimes even broadband and energy access. That what we've seen in an empirical project we've done, which has looked at over 195 cities and over 500 projects and policies with them, what we've seen is that, particularly in thick urban agglomerations, these kind of locally constructed common goods, community land trust, in which, for instance, the city is willing to either transfer or allow a collectivity to use land or existing buildings to create housing, to create commercial space, to create green space, wireless and broadband microgrids, or micro networks. So here in New York City, I actually live in New York City and have for a long time. Here in New York City, we're working on a community broadband network in Harlem, tapping into the smart city infrastructure of New York, because even though New York is a smart city, 40% of residents in Harlem and communities of colors don't have access to broadband in their home. Energy microgrids. I'm on the New York City panel on climate change, right? There are some communities here that want to be able to tap into the excess energy of public buildings, the local university, the local hospitals, to capture that in microgrids, let's say in Harlem or the Bronx, to reduce energy costs for residents there who are having a hard time. So, and cities are increasingly willing to do this, right? Willing to work with these communities. So New York City Housing Department has a community land trust policy where it will, give $1 million, up to $1 million to communities to plan out a trust so that it can transfer vacant city land. Even in cities, global cities like New York, there's available infrastructure. So we have conceptualized the city as a commons in the sense that the basic infrastructure of the city should be accessible to communities to create goods that promote their flourishing: housing, food, broadband, energy. And our Co-Cities project is really designed to capture the ways that we see these kinds of institutional forms come up to co-govern and co-construct, co-produce these forms of common goods along with the city and other actors in a very polycentric way, which means all of the services aren't coming through a centralized government, right? The recognition that different communities have very different needs and need different solutions, and that they're part of the solution, but they need capacity, they need resources, and they're able to bring the innovation working with other actors to meet their needs, but also need the state, right? Need the city to transfer some of its resources.
Thank you, Sheila. Maybe one final question. We've got just a couple of minutes, maybe sort of close this to go back to where you began with the Parliament of Global Mayors and their soft power and so on. They have made statements on their role in during COVID and post-COVID. Do you see the role of cities in a post-COVID 21st century? You mentioned before that the cities are the sort of hubs of power for the 21st century. How will they respond following this crisis? What is the Global Parliament of Mayors proposing?
Well, the mayor's been working through, so I should say back in 2018, before COVID hit, the Global Parliament of Mayors was focused on actually urban pandemics, right? Because the recognition was that pandemics were at our doorstep, and that cities needed to prepare for them. And so when COVID hit, there was already an infrastructure for mayors to share practices on what they were doing to respond locally to the needs, irregardless of what their nation states were doing. Now, post-COVID, right, there is a lot of work by mayors on, again, I see these networks, again, as kind of sites of sharing and diffusing. So they don't have a common plan, but what they are sharing is the ways that their cities are responding to what life is going to be like post-COVID, whether that's the 15-minute city that, the mayor of Paris has come up with, whether it's how do you use now all of this vacant commercial real estate in American cities. People aren't going to come back to their jobs to meet the needs of people who are homeless. Whether we need to be creating cities in which people can not gather in dense areas, but, more bike lanes or more places for urban life to exist and to thrive. And how do you design that? And where do you get the money for that? Including, I think, migration, again, not just climate, but I think that the COVID crisis has resulted in a kind of urban shuffle, right? There are cities that are now, their infrastructure is under stress because they're seeing a lot of migration to their cities as a result of COVID. So it's less that I think they're speaking with one voice on this, as more, again, it is a site for a lot of innovation and for diffusion of best practices and policies that these mayors then go back home and they begin to put in place.
Thank you. I see that it's 12:30. Sheila, thank you so much. Thank you for your stimulating and inspiring talk. And I think I mentioned to you that all the talks and question and answer periods are being recorded. So we'll be able to share this more broadly after 4 days. I think people are moving in and out, on and off the screen, but this will be available. I'm delighted that you accepted our invitation. Thank you for spending part of your Saturday with us, and I look forward to a continued conversation with you. Thanks so much.
Thank you. It's been my honor. Thanks for inviting me.
Thank you. Thank you so much. Bye-bye. Bye, everyone.